The thing about being a police officer is that you spend your whole career learning how to read people. You study micro-expressions, body language, the small tells that separate truth from deception. You sit across interrogation tables from killers and conmen, and you watch their eyes, their hands, the slight tension in their jaw when they're hiding something. After 15 years on the force, Detective Raymond Kowalski believed he could spot a lie from across a room. He never once thought to look for one across his own dinner table. Raymond had joined the Springfield Police Department at 22, fresh out of the academy, with a pressed uniform and an idealism that his sergeant had tried and failed to beat out of him. He was the kind of cop who remembered victims' names, who followed up on cases long after they were officially closed, who brought coffee to overnight witnesses and meant it when he said he was sorry for their loss. His colleagues respected him. His captain trusted him. And for the last 6 years, he had believed, with the same certainty he placed in his badge and his gun, that his wife, Patricia, loved him completely. They had met at a charity fundraiser for the families of fallen officers. Patricia was volunteering at the registration table, wearing a yellow dress that caught the light, her dark hair pulled up in a loose arrangement that kept slipping free around her temples. She had laughed at herself when she dropped a stack of name tags, and Raymond had knelt to help her gather them, and their hands had reached for the same laminated card at the same moment, and that had been it. 3 years of dating, a modest wedding in her parents' backyard, and then this, a 2-story house on Elmwood Drive with a vegetable garden Patricia kept meaning to tend and a spare bedroom they had recently painted a soft sage green in preparation for their daughter, who was due in 11 weeks. The pregnancy had been an enormous joy. Raymond had cried at the first ultrasound, silently, turning his face slightly so the technician wouldn't see, though Patricia had seen and had held his hand tighter. He had downloaded 4 different parenting apps. He had built the crib twice because he hadn't liked how the first assembly looked, and the second time he'd spent 3 hours on it, cross-referencing the instructions with tutorial videos until it was absolutely right. He was going to be the kind of father his own father had never been, present, patient, steady as stone. The first sign that something had shifted came in early October, about 7 weeks before the story reached its unforgiving conclusion. Patricia began taking her phone into the bathroom. It was such a small thing that Raymond almost didn't register it. People bring their phones into bathrooms all the time, he knew that. But Patricia had always been someone who left her phone face down on the kitchen counter while they ate dinner, who sometimes forgot it was charging in the bedroom for entire afternoons. She was not someone who slept with it on her nightstand, screen down, volume muted. She was not someone who stepped out of the room to take calls. Then she started doing all of those things. Raymond told himself it was pregnancy. He had read enough forums and enough books to know that hormonal changes could make women withdraw, become protective of private thoughts, need space in ways they hadn't before. He told himself he was projecting professional habits onto a personal situation. He told himself a lot of things in October, and he was very good at telling himself things when he needed to believe them. But there was a particular Saturday in mid-October when Patricia said she was going to her friend Donna's house for lunch, and Raymond drove past Donna's house that afternoon. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. He was just running an errand that took him through that neighborhood, and Patricia's car was not there. He called Donna on a pretext an hour later, some leftover instinct from a case that no longer existed. Donna mentioned offhandedly that she hadn't seen Patricia in weeks, that they had been meaning to get together, but you know how it is, everyone's so busy. Raymond hung up and sat in his car for 4 minutes, very still, watching a sprinkler move back and forth across a neighbor's lawn. He didn't confront Patricia that night. He told himself he needed more information before he drew conclusions. That was the detective's instinct. Do not act on partial evidence. He told himself this was also why he began, quietly and with deep shame, to pay closer attention. He noticed that her mileage was higher than her trips accounted for. He noticed a name that appeared in her texts, just a first name, Kevin, that she had never mentioned to him. He noticed that she seemed more careful around him, more deliberate, as if she were always slightly on stage. He noticed, and he said nothing, and he worked longer hours and tried to exhaust the thing he was feeling down to a manageable size. The call came in on a Tuesday evening in November at 9:14 p.m. Raymond was at his desk finishing a report when the tip came through the department's anonymous line, forwarded to him because the caller had specifically mentioned narcotics activity at an address on Meridian Street, an address in his case area. The detail was specific enough to take seriously. Second floor, apartment 2C, a man named Kevin operating a distribution network from a residential unit. Raymond logged the call, checked the address against existing case files, found a tangential connection to a case he was building, and decided to go himself rather than send a patrol unit. He wanted to see the space firsthand. He would call for backup if the initial approach suggested he needed it. He drove to Meridian Street alone, which was a violation of protocol he would not acknowledge until much later. The building was an older mid-rise, the kind that had been constructed in the 70s and quietly neglected ever since. Carpet in the lobby worn to the underlay near the elevator, mailboxes with broken latches, a buzzer panel where half the name slots were empty. Raymond showed his badge to the building manager, a tired-looking man who didn't ask questions, and took the stairs to the second floor. Apartment 2C was at the end of the corridor. There was a thin strip of light under the door. Raymond could hear a television from somewhere down the hall, and from behind the door, low voices, and then a woman's laugh, a short, familiar sound that his body recognized before his mind did. He stood in that hallway for 3 full seconds. Then he knocked, identifying himself as a police officer, and the voices went instantly silent, and there was the sound of movement, and he knocked again and said it louder, and after a moment the door opened. The man who answered was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, looking at Raymond with the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to look guilty. He was good-looking in an uncomplicated way, the kind of face that didn't reveal much. Raymond had a professional eye for faces and what they were hiding. "Kevin," Raymond said, and the man nodded slightly, and Raymond showed his badge, and then he looked past Kevin's shoulder and into the apartment, and the world rearranged itself completely. Patricia was sitting on the couch, her feet tucked up beside her, a mug in both hands. She was wearing a cardigan he had not seen before, grey, oversized, and her pregnancy was very visible, the full, unmistakable round of it, and she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of someone who has been caught so completely that there is no longer any point in the pretense of innocence. For a moment, nobody said anything. Raymond stepped into the apartment because he did not know what else to do. He looked at Patricia on the couch. He looked at the 2 mugs on the coffee table. He looked at the apartment, small, neatly furnished personal items on the shelves, and understood that this was not a location being used to distribute narcotics. He understood that the anonymous tip had been something else, maybe a setup, maybe a mistake, maybe the universe deciding that he had told himself enough stories for long enough. "Raymond," Patricia said. Her voice was very quiet. He held up a hand. Not a gesture of anger, but of pause. He genuinely needed a second before anyone spoke. His heart was doing something unusual, beating too hard and somehow too slowly at the same time, and there was a noise in his ears that he recognized distantly as his own blood pressure spiking. He had been trained to stay calm in volatile situations. He understood, with the methodical part of his brain that never entirely turned off, that everything that happened in the next few minutes would matter enormously, and that he could not afford to lose control in any direction. "I'm going to need you to talk to me," he said to Patricia, and his voice came out steady, which surprised him. She began to cry, immediately, the way people cry when relief and shame arrive at the same time. Kevin moved toward her, and Raymond turned and looked at him, and Kevin stopped moving. "Please sit down," Raymond said, and Kevin sat. What followed was 45 minutes that Raymond would spend years trying to understand and organize into something that made sense. Patricia talked. Kevin occasionally interjected and then went quiet when Raymond looked at him. Raymond asked questions in the measured tone he used in professional interviews, not because he felt measured, but because it was the only mode he had for a conversation this catastrophic. The affair had been going on for 4 months. They had met through a colleague of Patricia's. It had started, Patricia said, during a period when she and Raymond had been struggling. She used the word struggling, and Raymond tried to remember what the struggle had been and couldn't identify a specific thing, which was somehow the worst part. The idea that the marriage had been fragmenting in ways he hadn't even recognized as fractures. She said she hadn't planned it. She said she had tried to end it twice. She said she was sorry in the way that people say sorry when they know the word is entirely inadequate, but is the only word available. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of the night entirely. She said she didn't know who the father was. Raymond sat very still for a moment. He had looked at every ultrasound photograph. He had picked the name, Lillian, after his grandmother. He had built the crib twice and spent an entire Saturday assembling a changing table and repainted one wall of the nursery because the first colour had looked different on the swatch than it did at full coverage. He had put his hand on Patricia's stomach at night and felt the small, insistent movements inside and understood for the first time in his life what people meant when they said something was precious. He stood up. "Raymond," Patricia said, alarmed by something in his posture. "I'm not going to do anything," he said quietly. "I need you to know that. I'm not going to do anything." He wasn't sure in that moment whether he was saying it to reassure them or to remind himself. He walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. Someone was warming up a car. The exhaust drifted upward in the cold air. He watched it for a long time. Kevin spoke then. He said, haltingly, that he had not known Patricia was married at first, which was partially true and partially self-serving in the way that most explanations are. He said that by the time he knew, he was already, and he paused here, searching for a word, involved. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know what else to say. Raymond turned from the window and looked at him. "Are you in love with her?" he asked. Kevin looked startled by the directness of the question. He glanced at Patricia. Then he nodded slightly, which was possibly the most honest thing anyone said in that room all night. Raymond looked at Patricia. She was looking at her hands, her shoulders rounded, her face very pale in the lamplight. She looked young and frightened and desperately tired in a way that wasn't just pregnancy, and Raymond felt, alongside the grief and the rage that he was keeping below the waterline through sheer professional discipline, a complicated sorrow for her, which surprised him, and which he understood later was love trying to survive its own demolition. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her, so he was at her eye level. "Are you safe?" he asked. "Are you healthy? The baby?" "We're fine," she said, and her voice cracked. "We're both fine." He nodded. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he had set it. "I'm going to leave," he said. "I want you to call me before you drive home. You shouldn't be driving alone tonight." He was almost at the door when Kevin said his name. Raymond turned. "For what it's worth," Kevin said, "she talks about you like—" He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind." Raymond left. He sat in his car in the parking lot for a very long time. He was aware that he should call someone, a colleague, a friend, anyone. He was aware that he was not in a reliable emotional state and that driving was probably inadvisable. He put his hands on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the building, at the lighted window on the second floor, and he breathed very carefully in and out. He was not a perfect man. He understood that even in that moment, he had worked too many hours. He had sometimes come home with the weight of other people's catastrophes so heavy on him that he'd had nothing left to give. He had not always been present. He had not always asked the right questions or noticed the right silences. He did not believe this justified what Patricia had done, but he was not interested, sitting in that parking lot, in building a case for himself as an innocent party. He was too tired for that, and too sad, and too honest. Patricia called him 20 minutes later. Her voice was quiet and exhausted. She told him she was leaving and that she would be home soon. He told her to drive carefully. He drove home first and sat in the kitchen with the lights off, and when she came through the door, he turned on the lamp above the table, and they looked at each other across the kitchen, and there were no words that fit, so for a while they said nothing. They talked until 3 in the morning. It was not a healing conversation. Those would come later, slowly, haltingly. Some of them in a therapist's office, some of them at the kitchen table, some of them in the car on the way back from hospital appointments as Patricia's due date approached. It was instead an excavation. All the things that had accumulated unsaid between them over months and possibly years coming up out of the sediment. It was painful in the way that honest things often are, and it did not resolve into a clean conclusion, because real life very rarely does. Raymond's captain called him the next morning. Someone had filed a complaint, the building manager it turned out, concerned about a plainclothes officer accessing residential units after hours without clear jurisdiction. There would be a review of his conduct that evening, an examination of whether he had used his position inappropriately. Raymond submitted to it with a kind of grim composure. He had not violated anyone's rights. He had knocked. He had identified himself. He had not arrested anyone or made any threats. The review concluded without disciplinary action, though his captain pulled him aside afterward and asked him quietly if everything was all right at home, and Raymond said, "No, not really," and his captain put a hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything else, which was exactly right. The DNA test happened 6 weeks later, just before Patricia's due date. It was a prenatal paternity test, non-invasive, conducted at a clinic across town where neither of them knew anyone. They sat in separate chairs in the waiting room and did not speak much, and Raymond read a magazine without absorbing any of it, and Patricia sat with her coat pulled around her and stared at the floor. The result came back 2 weeks after Lily was born. Lily Ann Kowalski arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late January, small and startlingly vocal, and utterly herself from the first moment. Raymond was in the delivery room because Patricia had asked him to be, and because he could not have stayed away. He watched his daughter come into the world and felt the thing he had expected to feel, which was love, and also the thing he had not expected, which was a fierce and absolute certainty that it didn't matter what the test said. He understood this in the delivery room before he could have articulated it, holding this small person who was already grimacing at the world with her whole face. The test confirmed he was the biological father. He read the result alone, in the car in the hospital parking garage, holding Lily's folder of discharge paperwork against the steering wheel. He had expected to feel relief. What he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated, a recognition that the answer could have been different, and that even then, the love that had arrived in that delivery room would not have arranged itself differently. This disturbed him slightly, and also told him something true about himself that he hadn't known before. Raymond and Patricia did not stay together. That part of the story does not end with reconciliation, because some things, once broken, require rebuilding into something different rather than being restored to what they were. They separated in the spring, carefully and without escalation, guided partly by a counselor who helped them understand that what they owed each other now was a functional coexistence for Lily's sake. Kevin exited Patricia's life quietly. The affair had not survived the glare of consequence, which is the fate of most affairs once they lose the shelter of secrecy. Patricia moved into a smaller house across town. She and Raymond established a custody arrangement that required considerable negotiation and produced something that worked. Raymond requested a temporary reassignment to a day shift unit, partly for Lily's schedule and partly because he needed for a while some reduction in the weight of what he carried professionally while he processed the weight of everything else. His colleagues knew something had happened in his personal life and treated him with the particular consideration that police officers extend to each other in difficulty, not asking, not intruding, but adjusting. He still has the photograph from the first ultrasound. It's in the drawer of his nightstand, a small blurred image of someone who was not yet anyone, taken on a day when he had believed completely in the life he was building. He kept it not as a monument to what was lost, but because it is part of the story, and Raymond Kowalski, who spent 15 years learning to read the full truth of situations rather than the comfortable version, has decided that the full story is the only one worth carrying. His daughter is 3 years old now. She has Patricia's eyes and Raymond's stubbornness, which is a combination that makes his mother laugh every time she sees it. She calls him Daddy with the complete authority of a person who has never doubted where she belongs, and on the night she stays with him, he reads to her from the stack of picture books beside her crib, the same crib he assembled twice, which survived the move to his apartment intact, until she falls asleep. And then he sits in the sage green chair he brought from the old nursery and watches her sleep for a few minutes in the way that parents do, cataloguing the particular miracle of a breathing child. He learned some things that year that he could not have learned any other way. He learned that betrayal and love are not always opposites, that people can be broken and worth grieving for at the same time, that the discipline of not acting on the worst of yourself in the worst of moments is perhaps the most important discipline there is. He learned that evidence does not always produce the verdict you prepared for. He learned that some discoveries do, as promised, destroy everything you believed in, but that what you build in the rubble can sometimes be more honest, more considered, and more genuinely yours than what was there before. He has not become cynical, which is the thing people expect when they hear his story. He has become, instead, more careful, more patient with the distance between what things appear to be and what they are, more willing to sit in a parking lot for 20 minutes with his hands on a steering wheel before he decides what to do next. His sergeant once told him, during his first year on the force, that the job would eventually show him the very worst of what human beings are capable of, and that the trick was to keep making room for the rest of it, for the ordinary persistence of people trying to do better, for the grief that makes people go wrong, and the love that makes them try again. Raymond Kowalski, detective, father, man who built a crib twice because he wanted it to be right, has decided that his sergeant was correct. He keeps making room.